The recording was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. It had been made on a cell phone, propped against the kitchen window. On a Tuesday evening in October, when Darnell Watkins had looked out his front window and seen the patrol car idling at the curb for the third time that week, and decided, finally, that it was done letting it go undocumented. He had not planned to record that night in particular. He had planned to record the next time, and the time after that, because after 6 years of this, Darnell Watkins had learned to think in terms of accumulation. One incident was a complaint nobody acted on. 6 years of incidents was a pattern. And the pattern, he had come to understand, needed a record. The recording he made that Tuesday evening showed Officer Todd Crenshaw exiting his patrol car, approaching the Watkins property without cause, questioning Darnell's 17-year-old son Marcus on the front porch about where he had been and where he was going, in a tone that had no counterpart in any policing manual. The recording showed Marcus, hands visible, voice careful, answering every question with the precision of a boy who had been trained since the age of 11 to survive exactly this kind of encounter. The recording showed Crenshaw warning Marcus, for no articulable reason, to watch himself. Then it showed Crenshaw walking back to his car and driving slowly, very slowly, past the house before continuing up the block. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Darnell watched it back twice that night. Hands steady now. The thing he'd been trying to describe for 6 years, finally visible outside his own memory. He uploaded it before he went to sleep. By morning, it had been viewed 40,000 times. By the following Thursday, Officer Todd Crenshaw had been placed on administrative leave. By February, his 20-year career was over. 6 years, 4 minutes. The math of accountability. The first time it happened, Darnell thought it was chance. He was 43 years old, a facilities manager for the city school district, and he had moved his family, his wife Paulette, their 2 children, Marcus and Kessia, and his mother-in-law Eudora, who had moved in after her hip surgery and stayed because nobody wanted her to leave, into a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Street in the Millbrook neighborhood. It was a neighborhood in transition, which was the word the real estate listings used when they meant it had previously been almost entirely white and was becoming something more mixed, and which was the word the remaining longtime white residents used when they meant the same thing with a different valence. The house needed work. Darnell had done the work, most of it himself on weekends, because doing the work himself was faster than waiting, and because he found, in the labor of fixing things, a particular kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of the outcome. Officer Todd Crenshaw patrolled the Millbrook district. He had for 8 years before the Watkins family arrived, and he knew the neighborhood the way certain officers know their territory. Not as a community to serve, but as a geography to control, a map of who belonged and who required monitoring. He was 51 years old, a 20-year veteran, the kind of officer who generates commendations and complaints in roughly equal measure and whose department manages both without examining the relationship between them. He had a reputation among the black families who had moved into Millbrook over the previous decade that was passed person to person, the way useful information travels in communities that have learned the official channels are not reliable. His name, his car number, the hours he patrolled, the behavior to expect. Darnell's neighbor Roderick had tried to tell him. Darnell had listened and filed it and not fully believed it because he preferred to form his own opinions about people, and because he had lived without incident in 3 other cities and 2 other neighborhoods, and because some part of him still needed to believe that this time, this place, would be different. It was not different. 3 weeks after the Watkins family moved in, Crenshaw ran Darnell's plates in the driveway. Darnell had been unloading groceries. His car was parked in his own driveway, engine off, not a traffic stop, not a moving violation. Just a man carrying grocery bags to his front door while a patrol car slowed and idled at the curb, and a uniformed officer typed something into a laptop. Darnell set down the bags and looked at the car. Crenshaw looked back. Then it drove away. Darnell's plates came back clean, because his plates were always clean, and because the only thing wrong with the scene was that it had happened at all. I mentioned it to Pauletta that evening. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired in the specific way of a woman who has been not surprised by this kind of thing for her entire adult life and has not yet decided whether to expend energy on it. She sighed to keep an eye on it. He said he would. Over the following 6 years, he kept more than an eye on it. Crenshaw returned to Sycamore Street with a regularity that was, once you began tracking it, unmistakable. Not every week, not on any predictable schedule, but with sufficient frequency that its absence in a given month became the anomaly rather than its presence. It ran the plates again. A second time, a third, at least 6 documented instances, all of them in the driveway, none of them connected to any observed violation. A questioned Darnell twice during evening walks in the neighborhood, asking where he was coming from, where he was going, whether he lived nearby, in the tone of a man who already knew the answer and was asking the question to assert the right to ask it. A questioned Marcus 3 times before Marcus was 16 years old. The first time, Marcus was 13, riding his bike 2 blocks from home. Crenshaw stopped him, asked him his name, his address, where he went to school. Marcus told him. Crenshaw told him the neighborhood wasn't safe for kids alone after dark. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. Darnell filed a complaint after the incident with Marcus. He filed it with the department's Internal Affairs Division in writing, with a description of every prior incident he had documented in a notebook he had been keeping since the second plate run. The complaint was received, acknowledged, and reviewed. 3 months later, he received a letter informing him that the matter had been investigated and no policy violation had been found. The letter was 2 sentences long and did not specify what the investigation had consisted of or what evidence had been reviewed or who had conducted the review. He filed a second complaint after Crenshaw stopped his car on a Saturday morning as he was driving Kezia to a swim meet, pulling him over on a residential street with no traffic violation as cause, citing a plat that had already been run clean at least 4 times. Kezia was 12 years old and in the back seat with her swim bag and her goggles on her head, and when Darnell told her to sit still and keep her hands where the officer could see them, she had looked at him with an expression that he would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. Not fear, exactly, because she had been raised to manage fear, but the specific sorrow of a child understanding, with her whole body, that the world outside the car was different from the world her parents had tried to build inside it. The second complaint received a shorter letter than the first. By year 4, Darnell had a proper file, organized chronologically, with dates and times and incident descriptions and copies of his complaint filings, and the department's response letters. He had continued the notebook, 21 documented interactions over 4 years, ranging from the minor, the slow drive past, the idling at the curb, to the serious, including 2 incidents involving Marcus and 1 involving his neighbor Roderick, who had been stopped 4 times in the same 6-month period, and whose complaints had received the same form letter as Darnell's. He had connected with 2 other black families on adjoining streets who reported similar patterns with the same officer. He had spoken with a civil rights attorney named Gabriel Osei, who reviewed his file and told him, without minimizing how right he was to be concerned, that pattern documentation alone, absent a recorded incident or corroborating witness testimony on the record, was unlikely to produce administrative action against a 20-year officer with a clean commendation sheet. The department would continue to find no policy violation. It would do so indefinitely, because it had been doing so for years. What Gabriel told him that he held on to was this: document everything. Date it, time it, describe it. Get it outside your own memory and into something that can be produced. Because the day the department cannot claim it didn't know will require evidence that it knew. Build the evidence. Be ready. She cited something else, too, that he didn't write down because he didn't need to. It went in directly, the way certain things do when they arrive at exactly the right moment, in the exact right words. She said the problem with pattern documentation was that patterns are only visible from the outside, and the people with power to act were always standing inside the institution looking out. And institutions have a natural tendency to protect their own surfaces. A single complaint was a scratch on the surface. 6 years of complaints, documented precisely, with dates and names and cross-referencing witnesses, was a record that made the surface impossible to maintain. It needed to build something so complete that the question wouldn't be whether they believed him. The question would be whether they were willing to say, in public and on paper, that they did not. He went home and started a second notebook. In year 5, Marcus turned 16. He was a careful, serious kid who read more than his father had at the same age, played bass guitar badly and with complete commitment, and had inherited from Darnell the particular quality of paying close attention to things without broadcasting that he was paying attention. He had grown up in a house where his father tracked the movements of a patrol car in a notebook, and he understood, with the clarity of a child who has absorbed something through the walls of his home, that the world outside required documentation the way certain chemical environments require protective gear. He did not discuss this with his friends in exactly the way that certain things are too large and too structural to make into ordinary conversation. He discussed it with his father. On a Saturday afternoon in the summer of his 16th year, after Crenshaw had done another slow pass down Sycamore Street and Marcus had watched it from the living room window, he asked Darnell how long it had been going on. Darnell said, 6 years. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When does it stop?" Darnell didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he was working on one. The Tuesday in October was not a planned operation. Darnell had been in the kitchen when he saw the patrol car at the curb for the third time that week. And something in him that had been patient for 6 years arrived at a different conclusion than patience. He got his phone. He opened the camera. It protected against the kitchen window frame at an angle that captured the porch and the street. It went to the front door and called to Marcus, who was in his room, and said simply, "Come down, stay on the porch, keep your hands where he can see them, and don't do anything I wouldn't do." Marcus came downstairs and stood on the porch. Crenshaw got out of the car. What the camera saw was 4 minutes and 11 seconds. What it captured, not just the words, not just the exchange, but the tone, the posture, the warning issued with no cause to a 17-year-old boy standing on his own front porch in his own neighborhood on a Tuesday evening. Was 6 years of what Darnell had been trying to describe finally visible outside his own account of it? He watched it back twice. He uploaded it without narration, without caption, without anything except the date and address. The footage spoke in the way that footage speaks when it shows what it shows without mediation. Plainly, completely, in a way that left no room for the particular mechanism that had protected Crenshaw for 6 years. The mechanism that said the word of a 20-year officer outweighed the word of the black man making the complaint. The video was shared 40,000 times by morning, not because it was extraordinary, because it was ordinary, and because ordinary was exactly what was difficult to explain to the people who had not been living it, and exactly what was immediately legible to the people who had. By Wednesday afternoon, the department had received over 300 calls. By Thursday morning, the police chief had issued a statement saying the department took all concerns about officer conduct seriously. By Thursday afternoon, Crenshaw was placed on administrative leave pending review. The review was conducted not only by Internal Affairs, but at the request of the city's oversight board, which had received Darnell's original complaints as it turned out, and had filed them without action, by an external investigator. The external investigator requested the complete complaint history on Crenshaw's file. What she found was not surprising to Darnell, because he had lived it. What made it matter now, in a way it had not mattered when he had filed the complaints one by one and to avoid, was that someone with authority was reading them in sequence, together, as a pattern. The 31 incidents in Darnell's notebook, the 2 families on adjoining streets, Roderick's 4 stops, a complaint from 3 years prior, filed by a black woman who had been questioned in her own driveway that had been reviewed and dismissed and was now, in context, a 5 data point in a series that no reasonable person could call coincidental. This was the thing about patterns. Each piece, taken alone, fit inside the department's established framework for dismissal. 1 complaint was an allegation. 2 complaints from the same family were a personal grievance. 3 complaints from different addresses were, at most, a coincidence. But 11 complaints over 8 years, read in the order they arrived, in the neighborhoods where they originated, against the demographic profile of the people who filed them. That was not a coincidence. That was a map. And the investigator, who had spent 19 years reading maps exactly like this one, read it with the complete attention of someone for whom patterns are not abstractions, but architecture. She noted in her report that no single complaint in the file had been forwarded to the oversight board as required. 11 complaints, 0 forwarded. That was not an oversight. That was a system. The external investigator's report ran 42 pages. It documented a pattern of racially targeted enforcement over a period exceeding 6 years, conducted by a single officer against black residents of a specific residential area, with documentation of the department's failure to act on complaints that should have triggered review. It found that Internal Affairs had processed 11 complaints against Crenshaw over a period of 8 years, not just from the Watkins family and their neighbors, but from earlier residents in other neighborhoods in his patrol history, and had dismissed everyone without forwarding any to the Oversight Board, which was a procedural requirement the department had quietly stopped following. The chief did not wait for the formal completion of the report. In February, Todd Crenshaw was terminated. At 42 pages and 6 years, the case against him was, in the words of the Oversight Board chair, among the most thoroughly documented patterns of individual officer misconduct the board had reviewed. The documentation had been provided, in substantial part, by a man who had kept 2 notebooks for 6 years and had been told repeatedly that there was nothing to find. 3 of Crenshaw's supervisors were suspended pending a separate review of the department's complaint dismissal practices. That review, initiated the following spring, ultimately resulted in the restructuring of the internal affairs process and a mandate that all complaints be cross-filed with the Civilian Oversight Board. The gap that had allowed 11 complaints to disappear into a folder without consequence. Darnell did not attend the department's press conference. He was at work. He got a call from Gabrielle Osei during his lunch break and sat in his car in the school district parking lot and listened to the summary she gave him. She told him about the 42 pages. She told him about the supervisors. She told him about the procedural restructuring. When she was done, she said, "You built this case. Not me, not the investigator. You and your notebook." He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the second complaint letter, shorter than the first. He thought about Kezia in the back seat with her goggles on her head. He thought about Marcus on the porch that Tuesday evening. Hands visible, voice careful. Doing everything right in a situation that required him to do everything right to be safe in front of his own home. He thanked Gabrielle. He went back inside. He had a facilities inspection at 2 o'clock. And a water heater in the Franklin Elementary building that had been failing for a month and needed a decision made about it. And his job was to make that decision and then the next one, the way it had always been. And he was good at his job, and the job needed doing, and the world was slightly more correct than it had been the day before. That was enough. For today, that was enough. Marcus, who had turned 18 by the time the termination was announced, heard the news from his father at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, quietly, processing from the inside out, which was his father's particular form of thought and also his own. After a while, he asked, "What happened to all the complaints before yours? The ones from other people, other neighborhoods?" Darnell told him what Gabrielle had told him. That they had been filed and dismissed and never forwarded. That the system had been designed, in practice if not in policy, to absorb complaints without acting on them. Marcus thought about this. Then he said, "So the notebook mattered because you kept it long enough." Darnell looked at his son, 18 years old, the same careful attention in his eyes that had always been there, the same quality of seeing the structure beneath the surface of things. He sighed, "The notebook mattered because I didn't stop, not because of what it was, because of how long I kept going." Marcus nodded. He had his father's way of storing things, filing them in a place where they would be useful later, not for bitterness, not for fear, but for the ongoing work of moving through a world that required of him, and would always require of him, a particular quality of attention. He had grown up watching his father maintain that attention without letting it become resentment. He understood now what it had cost. He understood, now, what it had built. Eudora, who had been listening from the other room with the studied non-presence of a woman who has learned that the most important conversations happen when the older generation appears not to be paying attention, made her way into the kitchen and put a pot of water on for tea and said nothing. After a moment, she put her hand on Darnell's shoulder. Briefly, the way you touch someone when words would be a reduction of the thing. He covered her hand with his. The kitchen was quiet. Outside on Sycamore Street, the morning was ordinary in the way that ordinary becomes something else after you have spent 6 years fighting for it. Who's the street? A house on it. A family inside. Theirs.